I'm Sarah Miglio, Dean of Curriculum and Advising, and I welcome you to a global confession, the vision and significance of the Cape Town Commitment. Our theme for this year's Christ at the Core Fall Series is Encountering Global Christianity. One of the beautiful realities of our Christian faith is that it doesn't belong to one nationality or culture. We're the people of an ancient and global faith, united with brothers and sisters across the globe. All Christ followers belong to the family of God, the global church, the body of Christ. And because of these truths, every incoming first-year student at Wheaton College reads the Cape Town Commitment, a confession of faith, and a call to action in their first-year seminar. And we have the privilege tonight to welcome Reverend Doug Birdsall, one of the evangelical leaders who helped facilitate the creation of the Cape Town Commitment. Reverend Birdsall is no stranger to Wheaton College. He graduated in 1975 with a degree in Bible and theology, and he was honored as Wheaton College's Alumnus of the Year in 2013. He's earned advanced degrees from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and Harvard University. And as you will soon see, he has a passion for the global church and the power of the gospel to change lives and cultures. He and his wife, Jeannie, served as missionaries in Japan for many years. He's also served as executive chairman of the Lausanne Movement from 2004 to 2013. And he led the movement through a process of global revitalization, culminating in the convening of the Third Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization in Cape Town, 2010. He served as president and CEO of the American Bible Society and as the founding director of the J. Christie Wilson Jr. Center for World Missions at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. After we hear tonight from Reverend Birdsall, two first-year seminar faculty, Dr. David Lauber, Dean of the School of Bible and Theology and Associate Professor of Theology, along with Reverend Dr. Amy Peeler, Associate Professor of New Testament, will engage our guest in a brief discussion and time of question and answers. Will you please join me in welcoming Reverend Doug Birdsall?
Thank you very much. The Cape Town 2010 Congress on World Evangelization and the Cape Town Commitments, which we are considering this evening, stands in a line of great historic conferences, consultations, councils, congresses that have been convened throughout the 2 millennia of the Christian church. As you study church history, you will become familiar with the councils at Nicaea, at Ephesus, at Chalcedon, and so forth. In the modern Protestant era, there have been a number of gatherings that have really focused on world mission. And again, as you study church history, you will become familiar with the Edinburgh 1910 conference, which was held in Edinburgh, Scotland. Interestingly, the conference that was held there in 1910 gave birth to the World Council of Churches. John R. Mott, who was a layman from Iowa, and also the president of the YMCA, had been very much influenced by the student volunteer movement. And he really helped to form the International Missionary Council, which came out of Edinburgh 1910, as well as the World Council of Missions. Now, the World Council of Churches, rather. In 1974, Billy Graham convened a Congress in Lausanne, Switzerland. And here you will see the connection between Wheaton College and the Lausanne movement. The Congress in 1974 was really an epic-making Congress, not just a historic Congress, but really created a whole new epoch in global evangelicalism. In a very real sense, the Congress that was convened in 1974 by Billy Graham was to global evangelicalism what Vatican II was to Catholicism. In both cases, you have global bodies that are dealing with the Christian faith and the modern world. Congresses such as this are not held on annual events. They are not scheduled to be held on a triennial basis or a quadrennial basis or even a decadal basis. But congresses like Vatican II or Edinburgh 1910 or Lausanne 1974 or Cape Town 2010 are really necessary when the future of the life of the church and its witness in the world are threatened, either because of internal problems or external pressures. Oftentimes, those external pressures have to deal with persecution, many times, or they have to do with the restriction of freedom or travel or whatever it may be. The internal problems usually have been along the lines of either a theological problem or some type of a scandal in the church. The Second Lausanne Congress was held in 1989 in Manila, and then the Congress went into, the movement went into decline. I'll talk a little bit more about the revitalization from 1999 and forward. But when we talk about the church being in crisis, when we talk about the world being in crisis, I think we have an awareness today that evangelicalism is very much in crisis. And I think we have a sense of a global crisis. There's a very significant global response to globalization. There was a sense in which the world was becoming inexorably globalized, and there were many positive developments, but we see a very interesting and in some ways really an unanticipated reaction and response to that. And we see that in our own country with the sense not necessarily of welcoming other people, but of building a wall, wanting to pull out of international agreements, wanting to look only after our own interest. We've just seen the news recently of our troops being pulled out of northern Syria and seeing the invasion of the Turks, and to have national leaders saying, well, that's 6,000 miles away, as if it doesn't matter to us. Just yesterday, I was in Dallas, Texas, meeting with a very good friend of mine, my age, also an evangelical, and he said, I'm really not a globalist anymore. I'm a nationalist. Now I thought, what happened to the idea of being people who were a part of the global church? What happened to people who had a vision for the global, eternal, redemptive work of God in the world? Newbigin, a great missionary, a great theologian of the 20th century, stated that actually the church is always in crisis. It's only that at certain times we are actually aware of it. If you've ever sat in the cockpit of an airplane, you know that the plane is off course most of the time. And it's the pilot's job not only to put in the points of destination prior to the flight, but to make sure that during the flight that adjustments are made to ensure that the point from which you take off and the point at which you land corresponds to the plan. And every once in a while, we hear of a pilot who actually lands at the wrong airport. And that's usually upon landing, they say, would you please close the blinds at your window? We don't want you to realize that we're at the wrong place. That has happened. I've never been on such a flight, but I've known pilots who have done that, and usually they are demoted or dismissed shortly thereafter. Well, we hear about people wanting to take our country back. And I think that as Christians and as evangelicals, as students and scholars at Wheaton College, we say, we really can't take things back. We can only take things forward. And so the question is, what is the course that we will chart? What is the way that we will find? I think of the men of Issachar, of whom it was said, they were people who understood the times and they knew what Israel would do. Now, when I think about this in the Lausanne movement, I've often likened this to our theology working group and our strategy working group. When it says that they understood the times, that requires study. That requires reflection. That requires research. That requires an understanding of history. You will understand that the best futurists are often people who are the most well-qualified historians. So there's study, but it also says they knew what to do. These were people who had wisdom, they had courage, they had leadership capacity. And so I trust that God is raising up men and women of Issachar here at Wheaton College. The Cape Town commitment, which we are reflecting on this evening, represents such an attempt to chart the way forward. I think there is a sense of dislocation. There is a sense of longing for fixed points or longing for home. There is a sense of being lost in the wilderness. I don't know how many of you have ever gone backpacking, mountain climbing, but if you ever have, and if you've done it a number of times, no doubt, at least on one occasion, you've had the experience of being lost or confused. And oftentimes it's easy to retrace your steps and go back to the point at which you made the wrong turn and get back onto the trail. But it's not unusual for people to have made 3 or 4 wrong turns before they realize they are very significantly lost. Now, what's one instrument you want to have when you are lost? Audience participation? A compass. I don't know who said a compass, but bonus points for a student somewhere over here who said a compass. Now, in a very real sense, it's a metaphor that this really does represent a compass for evangelicals. And I would say that on any compass, there are 4 primary fixed points. And I would suggest that for us as evangelicals, the main points on the compass are the biblical categories of love, of power, of reconciliation, and hope. At Cape Town 2010, in the opening evening, during the opening exercises, there was an overview of church history. And there were 4 primary epics that the people at Fuller Seminary helped us to look at to simplify church history. And at the end of each of the periods, there was a clip in the film that showed people, essentially it was chaos, but then there was the line that was repeated, and they thought it was the end of the world. There was a sense of hopelessness. But then as the next scene began, we saw how there was some anticipated leader or event that brought about renewal in the church, in particular region, and often that spread quite far and wide. So as we think about love, you will notice as you read this document that it is a document that is written in covenantal love. The previous document that came from Manila in 1989 was called the Manila Manifesto. There's a sense in which we declare this. We argue that this is true. Now, because of the fact that at Cape Town 2010 we're dealing with pluralism and globalization, the language of manifesto sounds a bit arrogant or confrontational. And so there was really a sense of we wanted to write in the language of God's covenantal love. That's a distinctive. There's never been a church document produced before in history of this type that was written in the language of love. And then when we talk about the matter of reconciliation, the theme for the Cape Town Congress was God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, or Christ our reconciler. We met in Cape Town, South Africa, where only a few years before the church had been instrumental in bringing down the terrible system of apartheid, which previously the church had actually helped to establish, much to the discredit of the body of Christ there and around the world who are not quick to bring it down. So the fixed points of love, of power, of reconciliation, and of hope. Now, before we go further into the Cape Town commitment and how it came about, I want to give you just a little bit of background on the Lausanne movement, which I trust will be helpful to you. And as I was thinking about my presentation this evening, I thought I could expound upon the document itself, but I think you're doing that in your freshman seminar. And so you have capable scholars and teachers who are leading you through that. So I want to provide background, which I trust will provide it both in a historic context as well as a global context. But I want for you to know something about the Lausanne movement. And I would say you can think of it in terms of 4 C's. First of all, Lausanne is a city. Secondly, it is a congress. Thirdly, it is a covenant. And fourthly, it is a continuing movement. Now, during the years that I was the chairman of the Lausanne movement, I was introduced in a variety of ways, many times by people who weren't all that familiar with the Lausanne movement. Because when I joined the committee in 1999, the only agenda item that we had at our meeting in Atlanta was, do we continue? And we met a year later in London, and we had one agenda point, do we continue? Because there was a very strong sense that perhaps it had run its course. So when I began my work in 2004, there were 2 questions that I was asked most often. For people under 40, it's like, what's Lausanne? We've never heard of it. And for people who are over 40, who are evangelicals, it's like, is it still around? And I wasn't bothered by that because there was a challenge, there was a movement that I felt had equity that could be revitalized. But as a result of that reality, I was often introduced in ways where there were a lot of inaccuracies, including the name. I remember one time being introduced as the chairman of the Lasagna Committee for World Evangelization. On another occasion, I was introduced as the chairman of the Louisiana Committee for World Evangelization. And one time, unforgettably, the chairman of the Lamaze Committee for World Evangelization. which actually I like the best because it's kind of a life-giving notion to Lausanne, Lamaze, Lasagna, Louisiana, take your choice. But it's a city in Switzerland on Lake Geneva. It was a Congress whose primary architect and convener was Billy Graham. 1974 happened to be 25 years after Billy Graham's Great Crusade in Los Angeles, California, that really launched him into international prominence. A few years later, 1954, he held a great crusade in London at Haringey Stadium, which really launched him into not only national but international prominence. So between 1954 and 1974, Billy Graham had convened great crusades, great preaching campaigns in the major cities all around the world. And he had met hundreds and thousands of leaders, many of whom realized they did not know one another. And of course, this was also the period during which the world was beginning to be globalized. Airplanes that could fly long distances with large numbers of passengers. Technology made it possible for people to travel and communicate. Billy Graham told me one time when I was visiting him in North Carolina, he said, we had the crusades where we met the people. We started the magazine, that is Christianity Today, where we could begin to communicate with one another on ideas. He said, now we needed to bring them all together. And so you see the influence of that great man in the crusades, the Congress, the communication, not only through Christianity Today, but through a variety of other means. The giants of that gathering, in addition to Billy Graham, were John Stott, the English pastor theologian, Ralph Winter, the greatest missiologist of the last half of the 20th century, Rene Padilla, and Samuel Escobar, two brilliant student workers and theologians from Latin America. You see here the providence of God in bringing together arguably the most influential evangelist of the second half of the 20th century, Billy Graham, and really the greatest theological mind, pastoral heart, in John Stott. And those men developed a lifelong friendship. It so happened that shortly after I was asked to serve as the chairman, I asked John Stott if he would serve as the honorary chairman. And when I called him, he said, "You don't need an old fogey." I said, "You're absolutely right. We wouldn't ask an old fogey to take this position. But we do need a wise and godly older man who has familiarity with the movement and its history and its values, who represents continuity with the future." And a few weeks later, he wrote back and said he would be happy to serve in that capacity. Every time I met with John Stott in London or with Billy Graham in North Carolina, they would always ask about the other person. And I mention this to you because it modeled for me a younger person, not a lot younger, but a younger person, younger in comparison to them, a person who was learning a lot, and I learned a lot about them throughout my lifetime, the quality of humility, which is really one of the great hallmarks of a true follower of Jesus Christ. And I think as young people who come to a place like this, you're eager to make an impact, right? You want to be great for the kingdom. And when Jesus was training the 12 people, he said, "Do you want to be great?" Well, I'm sure they all leaned in. Of course we want to be great. That's why we're a part of this. What's the secret? If you want to be great, learn to be the servant of all. And I saw that modeled in a wonderful way in these two great men. A third person is Ralph Winter. And he introduced a whole new paradigm to the global church in terms of world mission. In 1973, the World Council of Churches at their World Assembly had declared a moratorium on missions. They said, now that we have churches established in every one of the nearly 200 countries on the face of the earth, we no longer need to send missionaries. Perhaps educators, fraternal workers, medical personnel, but we don't need mission. A year later, in Lausanne, Switzerland, Ralph Winter, a brilliant missiologist who was teaching at Fuller Seminary at the time, said, "The church established among every nation on earth, not even close, not even close." He said, "There are thousands of nations that have no access to the gospel." Now, obviously, he's using the word nation in a new way, not a geopolitical entity, but an ethnic linguistic reality. Because you go to any country in the world and you'll find people, it's like, we don't speak that language, whatever the major language is, and there are so many countries where there are a variety of languages, which makes communication and government complex. But that really re-energized mission in the latter part of the 20th century and continues on to this day, where people continue to get the gospel to the very last and the very least, those who have not yet been reached. The last two people that I mentioned are Rene Padilla and Samuel Escobar. They were people who were university workers in Latin America when Marxism was just overrunning the universities. Padilla had studied here at Wheaton College, but he realized that the theology that was being written and taught at Wheaton College really did not speak to the questions of the people in that country. And because of the fact that, in a sense, they were rejecting a certain kind of theology, they were often thought of mavericks, liberals, Marxist, communist. And I know both of them. They're still both alive, and they are great people that said we were simply trying to make the gospel intelligible to the people of our particular immediate context. And as you continue to study history and theology, you will realize that all theology is contextual. All theology is sectarian. They really helped the global church to realize this when so much of the younger churches were basically imbibing what was taught from the more established churches and academies in Europe and in North America, including the fact that Christians don't dance, play cards, basically just don't have fun. And fortunately, we learned from the rest of the world that you actually can enjoy every dimension of life within the disciplines of a life that is centered in Jesus Christ. It really changed the global church in a very significant way. And then I mentioned that the covenant. Not only was it a city, a congress, a covenant. The Lausanne Covenant, if you have not already read it, I would really encourage you to read that. It's a much shorter document. It is the greatest mission document produced in the Protestant era. I don't know if there are any historians here this evening. Well, Sarah, where are you? Would you agree? Thank you. Think more about it. Because I've stated that many times, and I'm not as thoroughly researched and prepared as Dr. Miglio. But one way to make statements is to make a statement like I just made, because I don't know of anything that's been more influential, with the possible exception of William Carey's piece in 1792, known shorthand, the Inquiry. The inquiry into the use of means for the conversion of the heathen. The Lausanne Covenant really united the global church because it did provide language that was biblical, that was theologically rich, was really not bound to any particular region or denomination. And the Cape Town 2010 commitment, as you may have read in the preface, builds upon that, does not try to replace it, but builds upon it. Let me just mention two other things about the Lausanne movement, and then we'll come more closely to the commitment itself. The vision of Lausanne is simply responding to God's call to the whole church to take the whole gospel to the whole world. And then the Lausanne movement is often described in terms of the spirit of Lausanne. When my first Lausanne gathering was in 1987 in Singapore. I'd been a missionary for 7 years in Japan at the time, and I was attending my first international conference. And Leighton Ford, who's also a graduate of Wheaton, who was the chairman of the Lausanne movement for many years, was there, along with John Stott, Safir Atiyal from India, Godfrey Dose Mensa from Ghana, a number of really outstanding men and women who modeled for us what it was just simply to hang out in creative ways with younger leaders. But I heard them talk about the spirit of Lausanne many times, but I never heard anybody actually define it. I thought, I'm kind of getting the idea of what it means. But again, shortly after I had been appointed in 2004, Leighton Ford, one of my mentors, took me to meet his brother-in-law, Billy Graham. And towards the end of our meeting, I said, could I ask one more question? And even at that time, he was an old man whose eyes were growing a bit dim and whose hearing was not so strong. And he said, the spirit of Lausanne? And a big smile came across that handsome face, and his hands went up. He said, it's a spirit of humility and friendship and study and prayer and partnership and hope. Those words are indelibly inscribed upon my own mind and heart. And as I've shared that many times in different parts of the world, it occurred to me, it begins with humility and it ends with hope. That's the spirit of Lausanne. Now, I mentioned the fact that after the 1989 Congress, the Lausanne movement began to go into decline. And there was talk about whether or not it should continue. But the greatest contribution of the Lausanne movement, in my mind, there are actually two great contributions, but the one that I've appreciated most was its robust commitment to theological foundations. And what I had seen as a missionary who began my work in 1980 in Tokyo, Japan, was coming into leadership roles by the early 1990s. I was appointed the president of our mission in 1991. I could see how missions was becoming increasingly driven by management, money, and marketing. And that was largely driven by American donors, where the money was going from the churches and the mission committees into large foundations and larger donors. There was a concentration of wealth. It's not all bad. And actually, thank God for people like that. But there was a sense of, actually, we want to have accountability. How's our money being used? And so we would hear people talking about more bang for the buck. I never heard Jesus use that term, but I heard 20th century American donors use that term. And I don't want to use it in an entirely pejorative sense. But there was that matter of, can you quantify your results? If I give you this much money, how much will you, what can you show for that? And there again, there is an appropriate place. But I realized that it seemed like theology was taking back seat. And I would say that all theological reflection must lead to mission action. Because if you're a theologian, if you're studying theology, or if you're teaching theology and you don't get to mission, somehow or other you've missed the whole point. And I would also say not only that should all theological reflection lead to mission action, but all mission action must be theologically grounded. And so the two are inseparable. If you only have the theological reflection, it's a vacuous discussion. If you only have the action, it can be pragmatic. So we really need to keep the two together. In 2004, I was appointed to serve as the chairman of the Lausanne or Lamaze or Lasagna Committee for World Evangelization. In 2005, in November, I convened a conference call with 25 leaders from around the world who were people who had very significant influence in different parts of the world and in different streams of the church. Some of them were church leaders, others were academic leaders, others were mission leaders, but they really represented a cross-section of the global church. And I shared with them some of my concerns about some of the challenges that I thought we were facing, foremost among them being this whole matter of theology, but also dealing with the matter of the prosperity gospel that was just decimating the church in so much of Latin America and Africa, talking about the competition that was really dividing us in so many parts of the world, and asked them, do you think there's a need for a third Congress? Well, there was an enthusiastic and unanimous response. Yes, we think that there is. And so I asked that group of people over the course of the coming months if they would serve as an advisory council and help with the revitalization of the movement. The following year, in 2006, we brought together 550 younger leaders from about 90 countries around the world to really infuse the movement with new leadership and with new energy. And then in 2007, we brought together 350 people in Budapest to think more specifically about a third Congress and what the challenges were. Now, this is where we come very directly to the Cape Town commitment. If you have the commitment with you, and you turn to page 3, some of you have it, some of you don't, but you can trust me that I'm reading accurately from part 2, and you will see there's 2 A, B, C, D, E, and F. The A through F is 6 points, okay? And we had, I think, about 320 people at tables of 5, so there must have been 60 or so tables of people who were working together. And they were all discussing, these are people came from around the world, and they were discussing what are the issues that we think are most pressing. And then it so happened that we used a methodology called Global Cafe. Perhaps some of you have participated in that, where people are writing on the white table covers that are made of paper. There's a recorder, and then someone takes all of that and they analyze that. Well, out of 4 or 5 meetings of those 60 groups that went back to Oxford, where the Oxford Center for Mission Studies did an analysis of it, quantitative, and it was very obvious that there were 6 issues that emerged. And then there was another tier of about 18 issues that were the secondary issues. Those really became in a sense, the matrix, the structure for Cape Town 2010. And they really fell very evenly in line with the vision, the whole church, the whole gospel, the whole world. There were 2 issues that really dealt with the church, the whole matter of the unity of the church and also the integrity of its witness. Prosperity gospel being the most obvious problem. And so rather than talking negatively about the prosperity gospel, we really emphasized what we called his church: humility, integrity, simplicity. Then there were 2 issues that had to do with the gospel, the whole matter of the truth of the gospel. Now in 1910, when several hundred people met in Edinburgh for the World Missionary Conference, that led not only to the formation of the World Council of Churches, but to the establishment of a magazine called the Christian Century. The reason that they named it the Christian Century was there was the confidence that the 20th century would become the Christian century. That in light of the energy of the world mission of the church, centered largely in Europe and North America, with its cultural influence, its economic influence, that the other religions would just crumble in the face of it. Well, that conference ended in 1910. No one could have imagined what would have begun in 1914, when the world, primarily Europe, was plunged into war, where you have Christian Germany bombing Christian England and so forth. It did not turn out to be the Christian century after all. Today we realize that not only was there the confidence that it would become the Christian century was gone, but there was also even a loss of confidence in the Christian message. And so increasingly people are saying, do we have to relativize our language? Not only is our theology contextual, but perhaps our way in looking at truth, is that also contextual? Is it limited? Is ours one of many competing truth claims? I remember Os Guinness speaking on the first day of the Congress. This was issue number 1 on day 1. And Os said, if we don't agree on the fact that Jesus Christ is in fact the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by Him, if we don't have agreement on that, we might as well just shut down the Congress. We might as well redefine our mission enterprise. And so becoming absolutely clear in our hearts and minds about the truthfulness of the gospel was fundamental. And the other issue that had to do with the gospel had to do with reconciliation. This has to do with a divided, broken world. Does the gospel actually work? And I must say to you in all candor, as a man who's now 66 years old, there are times when I look at places like Wheaton College, Gordon Conwell Seminary, of which I've been a part, the Lausanne Movement, other things, I thought, does it actually work? Or is this just an intellectual framework that seems to have come out of from our kind of people? And that's why it's so important that in all that you do, not only are you advocating certain propositional constructs, truths, but you are experiencing the reality of the new humanity. Because the most powerful witness we have is not necessarily our theological propositions, but the model of transformed lives. There is love, there is power, there is reconciliation. God was in Christ, reconciling the world to Himself, Paul said. Therefore, we are His ambassadors. And so as young men and young women, there's a sense in which we are about the business of putting back together the broken pieces, the work of reconciliation. And then when it comes to the whole world, the last 2 issues had to do with pluralism and globalization. What are our priorities? In 2009, John Piper, also a graduate of Wheaton College, hosted us in Minneapolis at Bethlehem Baptist Church. There were 18 theologians, men and women, again, from around the world, and we began to frame out what is our identity, what is our duty. And those are the two parts of the commitment. What are our convictions? What are our commitments? The men of Issachar. Understanding the times, our convictions, knowing what to do, our commitments. It so happened it was bitter cold at that time. And Chris Wright, a protege of John Stott, emerged out of the 18 people as the God-anointed person. An amazingly brilliant man, very hard worker, very efficient, and an ability to write like a C.S. Lewis or a John Stott, I guess you would say. As you've read some of the language, some of the phrases, you realize these are really beautiful phrases. He provided an outline one evening while the rest of us were sleeping. And just as John Stott would work all night at the Lausanne Congress in 1974, so Chris Wright worked all night. And he told us one night, he said, it was actually kind of tough because last night I went to a little coffee shop that was still open in the middle of the night. And because it was December, he said, all of your crazy American Christmas carols were playing. So he said, if Jingle Bells and I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas shows up somewhere in the document, it's because I couldn't get it out of my mind. Well, it's very interesting because at that gathering, it was not necessarily a harmonious discussion from beginning to end, because you have competing ideas, competing agendas, but a framework was outlined and then developed over the course of the next 3 years. There were actually 20 consultations between 2007 and 2009 when we gathered, so 7, 8, and 9. The theology working group and the strategy working group both met annually, so 3 and 3, so that's 6 consultations. We had consultations in all 12 regions of the world. And then we had consultations in Budapest in 2007, Buenos Aires in 2008, and Seoul, Korea in 2009. So what you have in terms of the Cape Town commitment, this really is, what did I do with it? Did I put it in my pocket? Did I drop it? Where did it go? Magic trick, here it is. This really is the conviction of the global church, and it is the voice of a historic Congress that was held in Cape Town in 1910. Let me just compare it to an experience I had when I was a graduate student many years ago at Harvard. I had signed up for a doctoral seminar in comparative religious worldview, and about 30 students showed up. Dr. George Rupp, who was the dean of the divinity school, said, there's no way I can teach a seminar like this to 30 people. He said, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to limit this. This is designed for 12. He said, I can accommodate 18 people. He said, so I'm going to have to ask some of you who perhaps really don't need this course if there's anybody who would just volunteer to leave. Nobody left. And he said, well, I'm going to have to find a way to kind of determine who's really qualified for this. And so he said, is there anybody in the room who has not taken a class either in the history of Buddhism, which is what we're looking at, or Christian doctrine? There were a couple people who stood up and left. So sorry. He kept asking questions until we got down to about 24, then 20, and then he realized, okay, the questions got a little bit tougher. And by the time the last couple of people left and we were down to 18, he apologized to those who had been asked to leave, but he said, okay, now all of you here are qualified to be a part of the discussion. You will speak the language of Christian faith and you will be familiar with Buddhism, whether there were Buddhists in the class. Well, about a week or two later, somebody made reference to D.T. Suzuki. This is in 1984, so that's the time context. Somebody made reference to D.T. Suzuki. And one of the students in the class said, who's D.T. Suzuki? Well, the class fell silent. And the professor looked at him, you don't know D.T. Suzuki? You lied when you answered the questions. There's no possible way you could have answered those questions honestly and not know about D.T. Suzuki, because he was the person back in the 60s and 70s who really popularized Buddhism in America. And so the professor said, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. That was a very embarrassing thing. Now, I'm not going to ask anybody to leave this evening just so I know you're safe. But this is the point. There's a sense in which if you want to know the thinking of the global church and you're at Wheaton College and you're not familiar with the Cape Town commitment, there's a sense in which you can't really be a part of the global conversation. It's like this is the prerequisite. This is the required reading to help you to engage. And this will help you to realize that our faith is not just a Western faith. This is a global articulation and been affirmed by people from around the world. And I would say that right now, when we had a consultation here at Wheaton about 18 months ago to try to recenter evangelicalism not as a sociological or a political reality, but as a spiritual and a theological reality and life-giving dynamic movement. That was a very challenging meeting, but that's really what the Cape Town commitment is intended to do, is to provide an articulation. Oh, what I was going to say about that is at that meeting, the most helpful voices were those who were invited from Africa and Latin America and Asia and the Middle East and Europe. Because we need outsiders sometimes to see things that we cannot see. Okay, let me just summarize and draw this to a conclusion quickly. I want to just read from the table of contents on page 3. We love because God first loved us. We love the living God. We love God the Father. We love God the Son. We love God the Holy Spirit. We love God's Word. We love God's world. We love the gospel of God. We love the people of God. We love the mission of God. Now, he could have simply made declarative statements about what each of these realities are. But he actually unpacks that in the text that you are reading. But you see that when Jesus said, "They will know that you are my people," what? If you love one another. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment, what did he say? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Love is the giveaway. Now let me ask you today, when people think about evangelicals and evangelicalism, do people think first of all about, they say, oh, evangelical, that equates to the power of love or the love of power? When they think about evangelicalism, do they think first of all about Jesus Christ, or has evangelicalism become synonymous with Donald Trump? And this is not about politics, but it's about the truth. And so you see, that's why it's so important that in a world that is certain in not only dislocation, but disorientation, that we need a compass to help us find the way back. We do love God. We love the Father, the Son. We love the Holy Spirit. I trust that for you and for Wheaton College and for evangelicals, that the Cape Town commitment will provide the compass that helps us to find the way back. I hope it will help for you to be made aware of the fact that our faith is indeed a historic faith. Our faith is an eternal faith. Our faith is a faith for the future. Our faith is a global faith. God is still God, and the gospel is still good news. Now, young men and young women, professors and friends of Wheaton College, you do have a chance to make a difference. You have a chance to learn and to grow and discover that it is indeed more blessed to give than to receive, that there is a different way to be human, and it's the way of God's covenantal love. And I trust that just as a compass points us in the right direction, that your lives will be like signposts who point people to the way. And it is the way to God. It is the way to life. It is the way to hope and healing. It is the highway to Zion. And it is the highway to God's new creation. May God bless you, and may God now enlighten our hearts and minds as we continue on in a conversation with a couple of your professors. So I guess I'd simply invite you to do what you've already said you were going to do. If we can be joined here, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much. That was very informative and inspiring and challenging to us. I want to pick up a bit on what you were talking about at the end, because I noted in reading the document there are strong things and pointed things said about power, addiction to success, the temptation towards greed. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more and give us some counsel about how we might resist those temptations.
Yeah.
We're at an institution, we have status, we have privilege, we have influence. We face those temptations about power, success, and greed.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. And I think the answer really is looking at the life of Jesus as our primary model and not looking necessarily at the lives of evangelical leaders. Prosperity gospel really was exported from this country, and not from Wheaton College, but from elements of our own country. It was really born here. But I would say that prosperity gospel has really infected and infested mainstream evangelicalism. We are very much driven by celebrities. When my father was a pastor, most churches in the town where I grew up were churches that say between 70 people. 400 or 500 was a fairly good-sized evangelical church. A town might have a church of 1,000 or more. But when a person like a Billy Graham came along, or a person not as notable, the churches were eager to work together because this was something we could all do together. Well, when you have mega churches in most towns, and they provide a better consumer experience than the other church, pastors are really driven, sometimes consciously and subconsciously, to entertain people. And I think that I was actually here at Wheaton, not at the college, but I was meeting with a very prominent evangelical leader. And we met at a coffee shop, and he said, "Do you tweet?" And I said, "I don't tweet." And he said, "I just tweeted that you and I are having coffee." I thought, who cares? And then he told me he had so many thousands of followers, and I thought, who cares? Well, then we went on to another restaurant, and we were meeting some people from Australia, and he said, the only difference between me and her is that she has 5 million followers. And I thought we were supposed to make followers of Jesus Christ. And so I think that there's a sense in say, if you want to follow me, take up the cross. If you want to find your life, you've got to lose your life. Now, suffering and hardship is just part and parcel of the Christian life in so many parts of the world. And I think when people from other parts of the world say, if you're not suffering, if you're not experiencing any hardship, are you really following Jesus? And I think that that's something that we need to teach our people. How do you sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? So I think that to say that it's not out there, it's in here, we need to acknowledge it. And I think even at Wheaton College, because there are so many great people here and we pattern ourselves after them and we want to be successful in a certain sense. But I think you pray for faithfulness. You pray to God to refine your life, and He will do it. Amy?
So we are shaped by listening to those from the global church, particularly in how they experience suffering. Being located here in a place, a suburban area, a very affluent, many resources here, how would you direct our students who are hungry to listen to the voice of the global church? What are some practical ways that they could start to do so?
Well, thank you, Dr. Peeler. That's a very good question. And I would say, again, because we live in a globalized city like Chicago, it won't be very hard to find voices from other parts of the world who are right here. I went to a high school in Peoria, Illinois, not far from here, and in my class of 600 people, there were 554 white students, and there were 6 black students, 5 girls, 1 guy. And so I had a very homogeneous kind of experience. But when I came to Wheaton, even though it was still a majority white place, I very intentionally met with some African-American friends and began worshiping with them at a church down in Joliet. Now that was a real, what's so funny about that?
Oh, you said worshiping them, but you said worshiping with them.
Well, maybe it was a Freudian slip. I really admired them. Maybe I worshiped them. Thank you for the laughter, which was corrective. It wasn't meant to be funny. I began worshiping with them. Is with a what is that? It's a preposition?
Okay, that's good, yeah.
I guess prepositions are important in the language, yeah. But began worshiping with them to the God in heaven. And my categories were challenged and expanded. And this has to do with power also. I'll tell you an experience I had, not at Wheaton, but at that first Lausanne conference that I attended in 1987. I'd been a missionary in Japan for 7 years, and I was there worshiping the one true God, not worshiping the Japanese. I'm going to have that in my mind. But at this conference, I met a young man from Colombo, Sri Lanka, and I discovered that he was involved in leadership development. And he realized that I was. So one time we were having a conversation, and he said, Doug, you know any Japanese young men or women who might want to come to the Philippines to be a part of our training program? I thought, oh, that sounds wonderful. Let me think about it. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking, why would somebody from Japan want to go to the Philippines to study with a Sri Lankan when they could stay in their own country and study with an American? Now, that kind of came to me subconsciously, but as I began to think about it, what's the subtext of that? I'm better than you. You come from a tiny little poor country. I come from one of the most powerful, richest countries in the history of the world. Well, that's when I realized that there was an idol of power that of which I'd never been conscious. But it was only by interacting with other people, because when I went to Japan, people said, don't take your culture. And back in those days, we would pack our stuff in a barrel. As I was packing, I thought, how do you put your culture in here? How do you pack here? But it's like your culture is in here, it's in here. Well, I went back to my room at the University of Singapore, and I knelt by my bed, and I just asked God, please forgive me. And as I thought about it, I knew where that arrogance came from. It came from being a baby boomer, who's all my uncles and my dad all fought in World War II. We heard them talk every 4th of July about what a great country this was. It's the greatest country, so it must be the greatest country. And subconsciously, you think we're better than other people. So it was that encounter with a Sri Lankan, and I followed him now all these years, and I admire what he has done. He's back in Colombo now. And so I've been challenged. I mean, I never would have had the perspective that I had I remained in my own context, getting outside of it. And it's not that hard in Chicago. And I will teach you where you can worship with other people. Again, don't worship them. But if you can't find them, call me. Now, this is one other example. My sister, who lives in a small town in Indiana, she was at Cape Town. She was there helping out with the communications team. She heard somebody say one evening that 80% of Christians in the world don't even know a Muslim. My sister thought, I don't. And I'm guilty of that. So when she went back, she went up to Fort Wayne, which isn't too far from where she lives, to a larger church. And she said, you know, I'm 62 years old, whatever. I'm a grandmother. I've just come from a conference, and I'd like to meet a Muslim woman who's about my age as a grandmother. And sure enough, they introduced her, and when the woman who was on the mission staff of the church, before she introduced my sister, said, this woman is not your project, she's your friend. And so to encounter other people, and whether they're Christians from other parts of the world or people of other faith, there's nothing better to challenge us in wonderful ways. Yeah.
Thank you so much. As you know well, Wheaton College is a liberal arts college. Mm-hmm. We are equipping and shaping students for all kinds of vocations. Mm-hmm. A majority of our students won't be missionaries or pastors or work for parachurch organizations. I'm wondering if you have some wisdom for us for how students might think about seeking out their vocation and being equipped to take up their place in God's mission in the world. Mm-hmm. As they enter into law and medicine or teaching, etc.
Yeah, I was mentioning to you earlier that our son graduated from Wheaton in 2004, I believe. And I have 3 children, and my 2 daughters, the first one went to Princeton, the second one went to Harvard, and then Judd came here to Wheaton. And I've said on many occasions that I think that Judd got the best education of the 3. There's a certain social capital that goes with those major universities. But there are 3 things about his experience. First of all, your classes are taught by professors, and outstanding professors at that. I don't think I ever had a class that's taught by a TA or a graduate student. I mean, there's a place for them, but it's wonderful to be taught, in my case, Introduction to Philosophy by a person like Arthur Holmes, who was the greatest evangelical philosopher of his time, teaching freshmen. Leland Ryken, teaching Milton. So the classes were taught by full professors. Of course, there was a moral framework, and also there was a real commitment to a classic liberal arts education. My daughter, oldest daughter, went to Princeton. She said of Judd, he went to Wheaton as a Republican and came out as a Christian. That's only funny to a few people. But and it wasn't meant to be so funny, but the point was his primary identity as a high school kid was he was very involved in Republican politics. And when he came here, it was through people like Professor Amstutz, who taught political science, and others who helped him to think Christianly, biblically about politics, did not try to dissuade him from being a Republican, but where's the coherence of ideas? Well, today he teaches political science at Cambridge University. He worked in the State Department and then went to Cambridge and did a PhD. I have 3 children. My father was a pastor, as was his father, as was his father, as was his father. I'm a 5th-generation pastor. And sometimes people say, are you disappointed that your children are in ministry? The last I heard, they were. And so one's in medicine, and one's in education. The youngest one is in the academy. And so I think to say, what is it that God put in your hand? What gifts has God given you? And where is the intersection of the needs in the world with the gifts that God has given to you? And I love the fact that Wheaton College is not just a Christian education program. That's fine, we have that. But the people who study Christian education also study economics and philosophy and history. So the integration of faith with every discipline. And I think the Lausanne Movement had a congress or consultation this last year in Manila. It was called the Global Workplace Forum. There were 900 people who attended that. And Michael O., my successor at Lausanne, wrote an article in Christianity Today, said, I want to apologize on behalf of the 1% to the 99%. We've tried to include the 99% to help the 1% fulfill our vision. Actually, the 1% is to help you to equip your mission in the world. So it's a different way of thinking, isn't it? Yeah.
Doug, we're so appreciative of the wisdom that you've shared with us this evening and how that will benefit our classrooms. We probably have time for one more question, and we'd love to hear your vision for the future. What are you excited about, hopeful for the church, both here and across the world, and what makes you anxious in the next several decades?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm very happy about that. When I think you introduced me. Did you introduce me, or no, Dr. Miglione introduced me? Yeah, you did. Yeah, thank you. But as I read that, I thought, God has blessed my life. I didn't choose the home that I was born into, but Abraham was blessed to be a blessing. And I was talking with a young man who's from our church back in Hamilton, who's a student here. And I've known him since he was a small child. And I thought, and he also said, it's such a privilege to be at Wheaton College. Well, the many blessings you have in your life, I'm encouraged about what I see in the next generation. And having served as a leader of a number of organizations, I'm now in a point in my life, I'm excited about the fact that I'm simply trying to reinvest whatever I have. Whatever I have learned by way of success and failure, and I've had more failure than success, relationships, people that have poured into me, I want to reinvest that. But just a few weeks ago, I established a new mentoring group of people from around the world, and they wanted to find a name for it. And so we talked about this. Well, we came up with HZ820. Captivating? Okay. That's not even as good as worshiping the people down there in Joliet. But H stands for haystack. What's a symbol? Well, in 1806, students were meeting on Williams College in Western Massachusetts. And during a rainstorm, they took shelter under the overhang of a haystack. And that led to a great missionary movement in our country. And they were students who were praying for revival. I was so encouraged that these young men and women who were very talented, many of them actually are in their 30s and early 40s, are moving into positions of leadership. They're praying, God, do it again. We don't want to just study history. We want to be a part of history. And then Zechariah 8:20, that talks basically about the people coming back to God. And so that's where we get the shorthand, the haystack. That's the symbol of revival in our own country. Biblical Old Testament is Zechariah 8:20. A few years ago, I was down in Washington, D.C. This was at the American Bible Society, and I was meeting with a congressman named Frank Wolf. He had served for 17 terms, 34 years in the House. Very committed Christian. And he told me that the previous year he'd gone up to New England with his wife to retrace the steps of those who were involved in the Great Awakening, and to retrace the beginning of the missions movement in America. And he was discouraged because of what he sees in our country. And as we're talking about the Great Awakening, he said, Doug, do you think God could do that again? This is the answer to the question. I said,
this is not actually the answer, this is part of the answer. I said, I don't know, Frank. I said, back then, most everyone spoke English. Most everyone had a Christian tradition. People lived in small towns. There were churches. And it seemed like renewal just kind of came more naturally in the environment. I said, the 20th century, 21st century is so complicated. We've got so many religions. We've got media. We've got technology. We've got so many languages, so competing world. The 21st century may just have gotten away from God, just more than God could handle. Well, yes. Then he realized it's a facetious statement. And I said, if there was any time God was really going to demonstrate that I am God of gods, I am King of kings, I am Lord of lords. The truth is the truth. The light shines brightest in the darkness. If God was going to really show his stuff, wouldn't this be the time? And so there are times when we think, America's in decline, evangelicalism is in decline. Too bad you guys, you were born too late. No. A crisis written in a Chinese character has two radicals. Maybe you already know this, but one is danger, the other is opportunity. And so we're living in a time of crisis. The danger alerts us to something the reality that something is wrong. It also alerts us to the fact there is an opportunity. And I would say that it's praying men and women that God has used throughout history in the darkest of times to bring about hope for the people. One of my favorite Old Testament characters is Nehemiah. He was in captivity when he heard about the crumbling walls of Jerusalem. He went back to Jerusalem. When he heard about it, he wept and wept and wept. And then he prayed to the God of heaven. Then he got on a horse and rode around the town and surveyed it. And then he began to put a plan together. And then he raised the money from a foreign king. And they rebuilt the walls in 52 days, and their neighbors were terrified. And then he brought Ezra in to read the law, and the people couldn't stop weeping when they heard the law because they hadn't heard it for so long. And so if God has done these things in history, and he has, and God is a God of eternity, and he is, then he can do it again in our time. And that's what I'm pouring my life into, and God can do it, and he will do it. It may begin at Wheaton College. It may begin in Jakarta. But I'm glad that God is alive and he's working through his church. And I'm glad to be a part of his global church. Yeah, thank you.
Amen. Well, let's express our appreciation for this evening.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before you. Just want to end on that note. And love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbors yourself.